So good afternoon, everybody, or rather good morning in San Francisco, good afternoon in New York, and in Europe it's already evening. Welcome to this session on the fourth day of the DevDays. And today we've got, so I'm your host, my name is Gustav, and today we've got a presentation by Eric Haas on patient lists. Eric is president and CEO of Health eData Inc. He specializes in healthcare interoperability consulting, and he's also had quite some experience in clinical practice and moved on to terminologies before he moved on to terminologies. So I think that would be a very short introduction. So Eric, you could probably say more about yourself. So I'll pass on to you.
Okay. Can you all hear me okay? Just want to make sure.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, all right. So today we're going to talk about the Argonaut Patient List Project and just a little bit more about me here. My clinical experience is with dogs and cats, just so everybody's clear about that. So I'm a veterinarian. Yeah, and I've had a little bit of experience with several different projects, including not only the Argonaut projects, but also with DaVinci, and also in primary editor for several guides, including Argonaut Data Query /US Core IGs. So enough about me. Let's get on with the topic at hand. Today we're going to talk about Argonaut Patient Lists, and the Argonaut Patient List Project was one of our 2020 Argonaut projects, and was kicked off in March of last year. If you remember, that's just when we started all locking down and going through this craziness for the last year. And then we wrapped up the project in this February. So and as with all Argonaut projects, we try to pick and scope our projects to last about a year. And so this one is one of last year's projects. And before I get started, I do want to thank all the participants who participated in the Argonaut Patient List Project, because without their invaluable contributions, none of what I'm about to say would be possible. So this is just not, a single person or my contributions. It's the entire community, all the effort that was put in by the participants, including guidance and discussion, as well as testing. Okay, so the goal of the Argonaut Patient List Project was to support an interoperable and standard way to use the FHIR API for exposing existing user-facing patient lists. We spent a couple months going over scope, and everybody coming into this project, we said patient lists, oh, I have all these ideas for patient lists, but we had to kind of scope it down, and we kind of went through a survey and invited all our participants to bring in what they already supported in their EHRs and applications. And we had the notion of, this notion came about, we were able to categorize what was existing in the systems as two types of patient lists. You've had system-generated lists, which are generated by the system, and you had something called user-generated lists. And those are more like custom lists, things that actually a provider could create and tweak for their own particular use. But those were existing in an EHR, and those could be retrieved. And also another point I want to make for our project is we put writing, creating, or managing patient lists out of scope for this IG, and also doing a fetch of a client-defined patient list is also out of scope. When I say client-defined, I mean the client saying, oh, filter out these, we just want to get these, make the system, filter that existing list and just give me a subset of that list. That was out of scope as well. And finally, our final work product is from an Argonaut perspective, in this case, is going to be an implementation guide. And we'll talk a little bit more about the implementation guide and the process working towards that goal near the end of this talk. So, a little bit more background. So, when we say an EHR in this document, we don't mean to limit ourselves to electronic health record systems. Instead, we feel the same technology can be used for HIEs, care coordinated platforms, population health systems. It's a notation. EHR is a notation for something like an interoperable healthcare platform. So just want to make that clear. So user-facing apps often need to know things like, what patients am I seeing today? Who are the patients I'm responsible for in the hospital right now? A rounds list, if you will. Who are the patients in this ward? Those are kind of questions. And its core functionality is already supported by the EHR systems. Like I mentioned before, we did a survey. We looked at what they already support, and so we're not looking at creating new things. We're looking at exposing existing things in the EHR system. And we also know that there's no standard-based guidance for creation and manipulation, for the creation and manipulation of these patient lists that currently exist in the EHRs. So hence the goal that we stated. Okay, so when we started, there were several options we looked at. You could do a basic FHIR RESTful search to get the information. You could assemble patients in a list resource, and you could assemble patients in a group resource as well. So from all this discussion initially, we came up with a basic outline or a sketch of our API. And this is the overview of the Argonaut Patient List API. First of all, patient lists is centered around using the FHIR group resource. And there's reasons for that. We'll go through that in a little tiny bit here. But this basic API is simple. It's very simple, 3 steps. You discover what user-facing lists are out there. You fetch those patient lists, and when we say fetch patient lists, you're fetching a list of lists. What patient lists do I have access to? Let's fetch those and see what they are. And then the third step would be, I want to select the first one on that list of lists. And from that fetch, you can download the actual members that enumerate that list, as well as getting additional data about each patient. So these 3 steps. This 3-step process is kind of the backbone of what we set out to do. Okay, so a little bit about group versus list versus searching. So for patient lists, for Argonaut patient lists, you need to think group resource. I know there's a list resource in FHIR and there's a group resource, but for patient list project, think group. That's a tough one for people to get around, because you say patient list, oh, there's a list resource. Well, there's also a group resource. And for our use case, the group list works better. And there's a couple notes in the bottom of that slide, but that's a bit of detail about how we constrained the group resource for retrieving lists. And I'll leave that for you to read about in detail. So with a group resource, and here's a UML diagram of the FHIR group resource, has a couple characteristics or a couple attributes that we found to be important for fetching patient lists. First of all, just like lists, there's a way to enumerate who's in this group or who's in this list, but this one has an attribute called member. So the members in our case are going to be the patients that are enumerated in that list, in that group, in that patient list. And each member, you reference them by their FHIR ID, and they can have a lifespan in that group, in that list, and it can be marked as inactive or inactive. But the other thing that it has that's important for us, I think key to us, was it has the group can be defined by a characteristic. It's just not an enumeration, but it's a characteristic. And it also has an ownership of that group. Who owns this list? Who's managing this group list? So those are the 3 main characteristics that we needed, and that's why we chose the group resource versus the list resource. And it's always been a source of confusion, and trying to talk about this within people who know just enough about FHIR to get them in trouble, always thinking, well, it's a list resource. No, it's a group resource. So just remember that. Okay, so we're going to discover the first step. We'll go back up here real quick. So step number 1, discovery of user-facing lists. So when I say discovery, you can imagine if you're an app out there, oh, gee, I wonder what this EHR, what list they have that I can use or I need. So you are going to go and ping the EHR FHIR server and say, what groups, what lists, what patient lists, I'm confused now with the terminology, what patient lists do you have that I can take a look at? So we're going to use a group resource, And we want to, again, have the ability to search by characteristics, because you may just not want to say, give me all your groups. You may want to say, just give me all your groups, all your patient lists that are limited to a particular location, or that are associated with a particular practitioner or organization or care team. So that's why that characteristic attribute is important, because you want to be able to discover based on a certain characteristic. And you want to be able to search by who manages that list. Say, okay, give me all the lists that Dr. X. I'm Dr. X. I want all the lists that I manage. You know, that's what I want to retrieve. And just another technical detail. When we retrieve these lists, so you discover, give me all the lists, you don't want all the enumerations, because those lists can be rather large, for example, and you want to limit the size of them. And so we use what's called a summary search. When you limit the summary of the list, we want that metadata about the list and not actually enumerate the members. Okay, so here's an example search syntax for getting all the available patient lists. And you can see it says get. It's a basic FHIR RESTful get. Get group, and you put summary. You sort the summary, and a couple other attributes there to limit it down to either all the lists or limited by characteristics. And we also have some other characteristics in there, and that would be a custom search parameter that we developed that we're actually proposing to be added to the next version of FHIR. It's called the value reference. So you can actually use a custom search to search by a particular characteristic. So you have a characteristic, which has a code and a value. So the characteristics in a group resource are name value pairs. So in order to search for that, you want to be able to search using both the name and the value. So you have characteristic and a value reference gives you a particular characteristic. And we can talk about that later. That's kind of a detail. So once we've discovered the group, we've discovered what's available for us to look at, then the next step is to fetch that individual patient list. So you can imagine you say, hey, EHR, what list can I look at? You get a dozen lists and you want to look at the first one. So to do that, it's basically a simple FHIR RESTful fetch operation. You have the ID for the group and you just basically retrieve it. It's not much more, doesn't get much more simple than that in FHIR. It's basic fetch. So at that point, you may be done. That's all you want. You want a list of that, you know, what patients am I seeing today? And you're going to get a list of 13 patients. And that may be the only information you want. But typically, you want a little more information about the patient, because all you're going to get is, and this kind of display shows that, all you're going to get by doing that second step is maybe a name and a patient FHIR ID. So typically, that's you want some more. So you have, in the third step, you're going to fetch additional data about each patient. So in order to do that, the simplest and most straightforward approach, again, is to use a series of queries on the FHIR endpoint to fetch additional data. And what is that? That's basically a simple FHIR RESTful search. Is described in the base spec as described in US Core. So it's patient-based searches. For each patient in a group, you're going to get a patient ID. And then here's an example you can get. Say you want to get the last 5 observations or what have you, or the last observation, last out lab observation for each of those patients on the list. You do this particular search, and you can see in that search you have a get, an observation, and the patients equal to this patient ID category. So you can do that for each, so it's a sequential series of gets. Say 13 patients, you do 13 fetches to get that. There are other ways to do it in a single operation, but and I'll show that in a little demo I have later. But I want to go on here and talk about, well, sometimes a patient-based query isn't going to get you all the information you need or what you want. So we looked into that. So, you know, this is great for those simple cases where you just want to get, for example, you know, a condition or an observation, or even just get patient demographic data. But sometimes it's not going to cut the mustard. We need to have a little more options available when retrieving more data about each patient. So we created a couple extensions, we created a couple extensions to find that we defined to get information that's not going to that you may not get with a single patient search. For example, we have two specific encounter and appointment extensions that are attached to each patient or each member in that list. So the group member extension will reference, these extensions will reference the specific encounter or appointment which define group membership. For example, the appointment for each patient I am seeing today, because if you just, because the reason, the rationale for this is a patient-based search on encounter or appointment may not give you only the appointment you're interested in, because oftentimes you're just interested in the appointment that put that patient on that list, i.e. the appointment for the patient you're seeing today. And that patient may theoretically have 3 appointments that day. So it's not, and only one of those appointments gets them on the list you're interested in. So we added these extensions to circumvent, I don't know if circumvent's the right word, but to be able to expedite getting the specific encounter appointment that defines the group. Okay, so, and then we also created another pair of extensions to fetch additional data using a questionnaire. So a form that gives you information that may not be available when you do a set of RESTful queries. These could be calculated scores, a real-time measurement, stuff that's not yet that has to be calculated real time that the server is going to provide, but it's not existing in the data store in some FHIR resource. So other things could be an alert or even a current graph or a chart, a little binary that gives you some more information. So in order to do that, we take advantage and leverage the FHIR Questionnaire resource to create a form that's attached to the group, to the patient list. And for each member on that patient list, we attach or add an extension for the response to that form. So you have an ID to actually look at the questions that are being asked, and then you have an ID that says what the answers are to that question. And so this is a way to be able to get up-to-date real-time information for a specific set of data that's attached to a particular group. And this is all pre-coordinated because you don't tell, this is not for the client to say, I want to get these 6 things from these 6 set of data. This is actually stuff that's been pre-coordinated, that it's already being provided or pre-coordinated by the server who does the, who says this patient list has this set of questions you can ask. You can ask about each patient. Just want to make that clear. It's not something it's not a dialogue between client and server saying, hey, I want these 6 questions. No, it's the server saying, hey, for this patient list, you can get this additional data. Okay, so here's a use case that goes over this that the folks at Epic shared with us, and I want to thank them for that. So you have a use case of specialized care or off-hours care, which without requiring external clinicians to view, without requiring external clinicians on the viewing supporting end to store data on their end, they can actually get data and you look at it. So we had this idea of a dashboard. So there's an external non-Epic site, for example, or external Epic site, but they don't have to retrieve and store information on there, and they can actually look at the data in sort of a dashboard. So at the upper left corner here, we have a patient list with details about each individual. So the source site can calculate the relevant information, and it can be displayed on his clinician's desktop or dashboard. And then if that clinician chooses, they can dig into the patient chart and get further details. So you have, it's kind of like a heads-up display. So you have and it's sortable by columns and risk scores and so forth. So here's an example of the kind of information you might see in that dashboard that you could get through this questionnaire response mechanism for a patient list. So we have a patient list, and you can have things like risk score and changes since the last read, and all these other scores, a SOFA score for survivability, alerts, and a little chart there. So it can get quite complicated, but these are all things that can be refreshed, so you can actually go back and refresh the answers and get this up to date. And so this is all, again, this is all defined by that patient list in a questionnaire resource and then the data is supplied through a questionnaire response. We have this pair of extensions that give you this feedback, kind of a feedback loop. And again, I want to thank Epic for sharing this use case. Okay, so that's kind of a summary of what's the backbone of the patient list resource. I'm going to click back, just go back and I'm sorry, takes a little time to get back here. Up here we go, one time. Okay, so that kind of summarizes the overview here. So we had the 3 steps, and we're going to use a group resource. And so where are we? Where do we go, and how far do we get through in the project here? So we're just going to go back down here to where we are. Let me see if I can click and get ahead here. Okay, so we had an Argonaut project. We had 2 connectathons back in September and most recently in January, and we had several participants, including Cerner Meditech and Microsoft. Several clients were there as well, and we had a couple of testing apps. There's one that yours truly made. That's a simple, very simple. I'm very simple, so I can do things like in Python and Flask, and that's about it. But Microsoft made this really cool little React app that does some nice things on the client side. And our major accomplishments there would be able to demonstrate the basic proof of concept. Excuse me. The basic proof of concept for the above workflow for both clients and server. And we were able to identify several issues. We actually had several trackers that we created against the FHIR spec based on its work, and we were able to improve upon our existing work. Okay, and so I don't know the time I have here, but I'm going to go through this little. Okay, I'm going to go through this client app that it created, and what we're going to look at here is just walk through and demonstrate all the features in our patient list IG. Okay, so I hope we all can see this. This is actually the IG. We'll get to that in a second. Let's go over to the little application. It looks very similar. So this is just a little simple app that just kind of demonstrates the functionality of the Argo Patient List, and you're using a little Argo Patient List client. And the first step is again, discovery of the patient list. So we're going to say, okay, so, EHR, what patient list do I have access to? I'm a client here, and I want to look at all the patients I'm seeing today, or what patients are being discharged, or what have you. So we're going to choose our server endpoint. In this case, we're going to choose the FHIR reference server. So I'm going to click on this, select my server. I'm going to go down here, and we're going to click, and we're going to fetch. I'm going to fetch all the user-facing lists, but in Discovery, you can actually fetch based on who's managing the list, like is this organization number 42 in this case managing it, or is it some other? We just want to filter down all lists to the managing manager of the list, or we can discover by group characteristics. And there's several characteristics we define. And let me this is something we can talk about, but I can point this out right here. Okay, so here are the characteristics that we've defined for this particular project. Location. So I want all the lists based on that for all the I want all the patient lists that have this for location characteristics or for practitioner characteristics. And so for this location 1, 2, 3, for example, or practitioner 4, 5, 6, or organization. So we have these 4 things. We have care team, organization, practitioner, location as characteristics that you can actually filter your request to get lists, existing lists that are based on these different characteristics. So when the EHRs or the server is creating a list, they could create based on characteristics. And so you may be also, as a client, also interested in looking just for those lists that are based on those characteristics. And here's an example. So you get this group and this characteristic. Oh, it's not actually an example. It's down here. So a real-time example will be down here. So your characteristics location and your reference parameter is going to be some location ID, for example, example ID, whatever that UID is, or practitioner. So we have have these examples that I put out here, but these are lists that are specifically created based on a particular characteristic. So let's leverage that and do the search based on characteristics. For the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to get all the lists here. So we're going to just grab them all without any other filters. Okay, so we get a list of patients. I'm sorry, we get a list of patient lists. Let's say that correctly. We get a list of user-facing patient lists. These are the patient lists that me as a client, I have access to. So we have here 19 lists, you know, and you can maybe, you know, and you may, that's why we want to filter, is you may have like multiple lists, and, you know, most end users can only like digest like a dozen things or less. I can only digest like 5 things and I get overwhelmed with it. Anyway, so just a couple of notes about this. We're fetching lists based on a couple parameters. We're fetching them based on a summary parameter. What that means is we're not enumerating all the members in the list. It just makes it really too long, and we're limiting by type, and we have this tag on here because we just want to look at a specific set that we created. So if we look at what that looks like, that's basically a search bundle, right? If you go down deep into the weeds and FHIR, it's a search bundle. Here's a representation of that in a wire format. This is YAML. It's a bundle. I'm going to go down the bottom here. We'll take a look. Sorry about making everybody dizzy here. So it is a bundle, a search bundle. There's 21 total lists in here, and each of those entries is a let's go up to an entry here. Each of those entries is actually a group resource. So here we have a group resource. There's the ID. And then in that is just going to be the metadata about that list. Doesn't have any member information. It just has metadata. Okay, so we click on a list to get. The next step is going to be step 2 is to fetch the user-patient list, right? So we fetch that list. I click on this little button here. So, and after we fetch that list, after we fetch the list of user-facing lists, after we fetch the list of lists, list of group patient lists, a patient list was selected like we did, and using a simple fetch. So we just did a get that ID, and there it is. You get that ID, and so we get the metadata, and then we just get the members enumerated here in this little table, and so we have some 35 members here. So basically, you know, like I said, a simple get. I don't know where my get statement is. Anyway, it's in here somewhere. So that's just basically the group resource. And if we look at that group resource in detail down here, we can see it's the group resource. The resource name is on the bottom. Here's the metadata. It's updated. Here's a profile name, which is a bit of details about just defining that this belongs to the Argonaut patient list profile. But in here, we have a couple extensions we'll talk about later, but here's that extension for the question. This is a form attached to this group that defines a few of the bits of data you can get for these members. And then down here, just going to point out these members are listed here. Here's a member. Again, this is in YAML. You can look at it in JSON too below here. And so in our first member, we have a couple extensions, including that questionnaire response we talked about, including that encounter and appointment resource. These are all fully formulated to demonstrate the full functionality of the guide. But down here's our first member. So this is Mr. Becker Long, Becker 963 Long, and here's this ID. So we're going to get these 2 bits of information. So each member is going to give us a patient ID and optionally get a display, and we say this is an active member, and here's how long he's been on the list. So this is the member. We've enumerated all these members in this group resource. So I just want to point out, we're using this little shout out to the MITRE team for making the Cynthia data set. We're using a Cynthia data set for all this stuff, and it's really wonderful. It works well, and it actually creates these wonderful resources using the FHIR US core profiles. So all this test data is using that. So thank you to Jason. I think it's Jay. Actually, thanks to Jay and all the folks at MITRE for creating that. Makes all this possible. Okay, so the next step here is we have our patient. We enumerated this patient list, and if you're done, that's all you wanted. Great, good to go. But most of the time, you want some additional data. So we're going to go ahead and fetch some additional data. Excuse me. And like I said, there's 3 ways to do that. You can just do a simple FHIR RESTful search, like we talked about before. So you can do the basic FHIR RESTful search, and just to demonstrate that, so we have for each patient in the list, we're going to get, in this case, we're just going to get some simple patient demographics. So we're just going to go ahead and fetch the patient resource and get a simple demographic on that. So we got date of birth and sex. You certainly could do something like get the last patient and do something fancier. I didn't get far into the weeds in this little demonstration. I just got the basic information. Okay, so you can go through and serially, sequentially go through each patient and do a FHIR RESTful get and get all the information for each patient. In this case, we have just the first 10 here, but another case you can do, it could be 100 patients, it could be 1,010. So you do that at one-off. There's a couple other ways using the FHIR API. You can do multiple OR searches, or you can do it using a batch or transaction, and that just gives you a way to do it on the client side, do a single call versus doing several. And so if we do that. Oops, I got to go ahead and do this. So we do that. Basically, all we're doing is just doing a different kind of RESTful search, which has an OR parameter, and you can see you get them all down there at once. And again, just so you know what I'm talking about, here's the request, and it has, if you scroll across, you can see it has all the patients all lined up in one big, huge, long get. At some point, this becomes prohibitive, and you can't do that, and you have to use a post, but that's details from the FHIR spec. You can also do, let's get rid of that so we don't have to look at that information. But by the way, if you click on this, you can see all the interactions are posted in the app itself, so you can see what was done behind the curtains. So another way to do this is to do using includes. You can include the members that, for example, in the group resource, you have a patient ID for each, a reference for each patient, so you can just use that. The other one I'll talk about is batch. You can do batch transactions wherever you have. So you can do a batch transaction, so you can actually create a bundle and request that the bundle be, each of those requests in the bundle be retrieved. So, there's several things in the FHIR API that let you, retrieve all this data using the FHIR RESTful API. So that's the first way. Again, repeating the second way we talked about was using getting extra details via a questionnaire. And so, so in this patient list, there is a form attached to it that says, oh, you can also grab this information too. And here's an example of that in JSON, just so you know that you can get things like age, sex, this is score, this survivability score, there's a couple scores in there. And I think we also have where the patient's hanging out. And so, let's go back. And I'm really glad this is working. I'm hoping you're all seeing this because I'm hoping it's, it looks like it's working. So doing a live demo is always a bit nerve-wracking. So we have that defined in that form that we have. We have the form defined in the patient list we've retrieved. So in this case, we can actually, each of those enumerated members has a link to a questionnaire response. So for example, behind the curtains, it's going, I click on that button behind the curtain, it's going, hey, EHR, here's the questionnaire response link. So I want to retrieve, I want to fetch that data from that form data. And so, and oftentimes, that form data isn't really a static questionnaire response sitting in a server somewhere. The EHR may just go, okay, we need to get this data, and they get their little cogs and gears working, and they calculate all these values for you. So here's a set of randomly generated values. These are randomly generated, not a thing you can hang your hat on. But for example, that form had COVID contact, true or false, and all this other, the demographics and the SAP scores and a score. These are 3 survivability scores, and then where that patient's hanging out. So this is what I talked about, that little demo we looked at before, that little use case that we talked about that Epic provided. You have this kind of information you can retrieve because you've actually provided a hook in the patient list to get that data. And again, you can do this sequentially, serially. You can do it with multiple ORs or batch transactions. And I'll show that here. Okay, so that's the form. That's the way you take a form and grab specific data or custom data for each patient in that list. That's been defined. I want to point out that's defined by the server, defined by the source, and not the client. And then the other way we looked at was looking at getting additional appointment data for individual patients or encounter data. And again, there's a hook, an extension on each of these members, and it gives you a reference to that particular appointment that landed them on this list. There it is, and it just says it's booked, and there's the date and time and so forth. Similarly, for the encounters, you have a hook for that. For example, if this is an encounter-based list, you want to have that particular encounter. We have a hook in there to get that particular data as well. So that basically shows you the functionality of the entire API in this little app. There's links to the other app, the React app, that's been worked on by the team at Microsoft. That's really nice. And so that is the app that kind of just hopefully helps explain a little more what Patient List Project at Argonauts is all about. So here's our roadmap. We kicked off in April online. Before I said March, we kicked off right in the midst of the lockdown season. Right now we kind of followed. We finished things off, and we created a draft Argonaut IG. And so we have this draft Argonaut IG, and so our next steps right now we want to hand this off. So Argonaut's not a standards developing organization, so we recommend certain standards to HL7. So we're in that stage now where we want to hand this work off to HL7, to specifically the patient administration work group. I've basically started that process, but we want to get more implementation experience. We want to make sure that this is pretty rock solid before we start publishing in HL7. So we're kind of in a pause right now, waiting to get feedback on it and seeing how its uptake is before we move forward with that process. Okay. So we have like I said, we have the IG. It's actually right here, and there's a link there. So it is a HackMD. I love HackMD, by the way. It's a great web markdown guide. So it's an easy way to put together some narrative text. So we use this, and I actually mashed it together with some Postman examples. So it gives you a pretty good feel for what's going on, and also uses the FHIR publishing to create the resources. So we have here interaction and conformance. We have the introduction to background. It talks about all this stuff. For example, if we look at the introduction page, we can talk. We have this little sidebar about the group resource and goals. So out of scope section, and so we have the summary here. And I just want to point out, if you're interested in group versus list, we have a little sidebar here that talks a lot about that, and talks about the basic workflow. And then, like I said, there's some Postman examples in here. And Postman examples, running out of time here, just want to tout the little Postman examples here. So here's the basic workflow: get all patient lists, or get certain patient lists. And we have examples in Postman. Hopefully this works. Let's see. And what I like about Postman is, here's JavaScript. I'm going to go to my favorite here. You can look at these on the right-hand side. You get actually some script here you can copy and paste and play with. So I'm using requests from Python. So yes, you can use this, and you can actually get back some information. It's really nice. And actually, this is actually, I think, live right now. I really shouldn't have done that, but it's live using the Happy server. So you actually get a real response back. At some point in the future, Happy's going to purge all those files, and we'll have to reload them again. But anyway, so that's kind of a handy little feature there. And then we have the conformance resources actually formally defined. So we have the profiles and extensions in here. And if you want to dive into that, geek out, you can take a look at that. So we have this patient list profile. This is going to give me a little. So here's the narrative text, and then we have a iframe in here. I hope it's in here. Let's see. Yeah, there it is. And there's the iframe. So this is the actual formal definition, and you can see that in there. You can actually go to the site too and look at it. There's a formal definition. You can look at it in JSON and so forth as well. So yeah, so that's the IG. I got 1 minute left. Let's see what I got left in my slides. And so this is the temporary holding spot right now. And so we port it over to HL7, and then we'll go directly to that other, what's in the iframe. That's a formal IG publisher format. Okay, so now we're at Q&A time, and I want to find out if we have any questions here. Let's see. turn on my little iPad and see if I can find him.
Great, Eric. So that was really, really great. Really very practical tutorial. Thanks a lot. So we've got 4 questions in the chat, but I'd like to ask one up front. So you were dealing with multiple lists and you were getting all the data directly in FHIR, right? So you didn't have to transform any data. My question is rather, how did you have any issues in merging and patching data? Or was it completely out of scope of the project?
Yeah, that's completely out of scope. There's no modifications. We're presenting the server, the HR, or whoever the server is presenting what they already have. So we're not talking about any kind of editing or modifying or filtering that data on the client side at all. Okay. That's a great project for the future. Yeah.
Okay, so that made it
right now, just a little plug. Right now in Argonaut, we're working on a called Argo Write. We're just looking at basic, client side write to EHR. Yeah. So that's a bit more advanced than that. That's actually saying, hey, take this patient list, let's do some modifications there. So yeah, there's a few steps, baby steps. We'll get there.
Great. Yeah, that makes it practical and more accessible. So we've got one question by Linda, and she asks, could pairs use this to share their member rosters? How does this differ from the DaVinci DTR project? So I think that's the documentation templates and rules project.
Yeah. I have to admit right off the bat, I have not. It's on my to-do list. I'll probably do it today to review closely DTR. I looked at PASS and I looked at CDR, but I have not looked at the DTR project that closely. So I'm
Eric,
not
I meant ATR. I meant ATR, Eric.
Oh, patient attribution list. Okay. Yeah. Again. Yeah, I looked at that one, and oh gosh, I'm gonna have to take a pass on that because I can't remember. I have a little comparison. HR does things a little differently, but certainly you could use this as a way to access that information. And I'm gonna have to just stop there because I'm gonna be talking off the top of my head if I say anything else. I have to look at ATR again and see what the differences are. But I think there's a couple key differences there, but I think you could, if the group resources are theirs, and it'll be used group. I know ATR uses group as well, so you can basically access it the same way. I'm pretty sure, and I need to look at that more closely. But there's a couple key differences I'd have to take a more closer look at. Okay.
So then we've got another question by Lloyd, and he asks, how does the questionnaire define the data? How define the data? It is using SDC. Is it using SDC population? So how does the questionnaire define the data? Is it using SDC population?
That's a great question. I thank you for asking it. A couple things about questionnaire and questionnaire response. An example I used an extremely simple questionnaire form. It was flat, and so that's one thing that's a caveat. I think it's in the guide. I think it's beware because the questionnaire can be infinitely complex. So you have to have some pre-coordination there because your poor client's going to be stuck rendering these things, and if you make it too complicated, it becomes a real burden or chore. But we did in IG we actually say use SDC questionnaire as your profile. And then your second part was SCP. That's an option. We don't actually say that. That makes sense. But we don't say that's behind the curtains on the server side. That's a great question, though. Yeah,
that's from Lloyd. So I think here's probably some understanding issue with the group resource. So when will this group endpoint be projected to be added in the FHIR API specs? So I think you might want to clarify that.
So can you say that again? When will this group
endpoint be projected to be added to the FHIR API specs? I think there's a misunderstanding there.
Okay, so what we're proposing in version 5 of FHIR is as a new search parameter, which is the value reference parameter. And there's a couple ongoing trackers regarding cleaning up those parameters in group. And I think it's part of a set of updates to the group resource. I think that answers the question because the group resource is already, already in the FHIR specification. Exactly. And the other question would be when would this IG be promoted to an HL7 sanctioned implementation guide? again, we're at a pause right now. We want to get some implementer feedback. We'd like to get these things a little more settled before we take them and start balloting them through HL7. And there's also, ownership, who's going to own it and how it's going to manage through. So there's some logistical issues with that we'll have to work out too. But yeah, so I hope I've answered the question adequately.
Yeah, I think you've answered even beyond it. So how reusable were those queries across sites and systems? So when you actually had different partners in that project?
Yeah, so we've had the in the two connectathons we had my client was able to interact with all of them successfully. Many of them did not. Okay, let me put it this way. So many of the servers implemented pieces of each of the pieces of each of the components of the patient list API. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for more connectivity and saying what the real world experience is, and if folks are able, if we missed anything, honestly, because obviously we've had a few connectathons, but it's not enough to say this is rock solid. I mean, I've been able to demonstrate. I have a demo app, it was able to relatively easily create all the functionality and fetch all the functionality. And I was able to connect with everybody and demonstrate, what it can do.
Great. So maybe we can just fit the last question we have here. What is the relation between bulk data and Argonaut? I think you just mentioned.
So bulk data, was a smart. There was a bulk data talk, and I'd recommend if it's a webinar. There's a video recording of that. I'd recommend that they go and look at that, because Dan does a great job explaining the relationships. Yeah. So the bulk data has been in Argonaut. It's also a smart project, and it's also a FHIR project. So it's gone through all the rounds, if you will. So it's everything. Okay.
So we're 3 minutes over time. So I think we've taken actually 1 minute over time. So we've taken all questions. I can't see any other questions. I'll just refresh my browser. No, actually, we answered all the questions. So thanks again, Eric.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody, for
really practical and useful.
And I'd encourage everybody to take a look at it and see and any feedback. If you have any feedback or comments or use cases, I'd love to hear back from you, because that's what makes FHIR stronger. That's what makes these implementations guides stronger. It's really about getting them out there in the field and testing them out and using them and giving us your experience, so we can make it, and the community can can make progress. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to everyone. Nice rest of the dev days. Wish you all. Goodbye.
Goodbye.